A rich CEO storms across a sacred plaza, spits the word respect, and slaps a silent tomb guard whose boots have not missed a beat in a decade of duty, then watches his world begin to crack. That's the moment everything changes in rich CEO slaps tomb guard. What happened next shocked everyone, from the first sharp step to the last echo under Arlington's white marble. This is a story about money pride and a line you just don't cross. Follow my story to the end and comment the city you are watching from so I can see how far this story has traveled from porch to parade ground, coast to coast, heart to heart today and beyond worldwide. The morning began with silence. A mist curled low across Arlington white stone, glowing faintly beneath a thin sun. Ethan Ward's boots clicked on marble, each sound sharp as a drumbeat. 21 steps, pause, turn, rifle shifting shoulder. Again. The rhythm was both ritual and vow, a language older than the crowd watching him. His sunglasses hid eyes that had seen tracer fire in Syria. A silver star rested somewhere in a box at home, but here his badge tomb guard was the weight he carried. Families hushed as they watched. A little boy, Tommy, tugged his father's sleeve. Ben knelt, whispering, "He's guarding soldiers who never came home. That's respect." The boy nodded, wide-eyed. A veteran named James Holloway stood nearby his granddaughter Claire, clutching a paper flag. "Why 21, she whispered. James's jaw tightened. "Because 21 is the highest honor. For the fallen, you give your best." The plaza breathed with reverence until a black SUV glided to the curb. Its polish reflected autumn leaves like glass. A driver hurried to open the door, but Gregory Kane had already stepped out. He wore power like a second skin, silver hair, combed back, tailored suit, gold. Rolex flashing in the sun. Behind him trailed his assistant, Laura Pierce, tablet in hand, nerves written in her shoulders. Kane's voice cut through the quiet. "We could automate this," he said loud enough for all to hear. "Why waste a man on it? A robot won't sweat, won't blink, won't demand a pension." Heads turned. A mother whispered, "Who does he think he is?" James's jaw set harder. Claire squeezing his sleeve. Ethan didn't react. He pivoted cleanly, rifle whispering across his chest. The air carried his silence like a shield. But Kane smirked, raising his phone, snapping a photo. "Tradition versus progress," he said. "Guess which one wins every time." Gasps rippled. Parents explained to children this wasn't a show. A veteran muttered, "Not a zoo." Still, Kane spoke louder. "My company's market cap is bigger than half this country. And this," he gestured at the tomb. "This is theater." Laura's voice was tense. "Sir, please, this is sacred ground." But Kane stepped closer to the rope, grinning. "What's it pay?" "Bet my driver makes more than this mannequin." Harris, the driver, flushed with shame. James whispered to himself, "Hold your line, son." Ethan stopped mid-stride, breaking protocol. He turned, voice calm but cutting. "Sir, this ground is sacred. Step back and show respect." The plaza froze. Parents clutched children. A woman wiped her eyes. For the first time, Kane hesitated, pride warring with fury. Then he leaned forward, smiling like it was a game. $1 million, he shouted. "To any veterans charity you name, just say my name. Right now." Gasps spread. Ben shook his head at Tommy. "It's not about money, son. It's about respect." Ethan's silence answered louder than words. His jaw was set, rifle steady. The crowd felt the air tighten as if something fragile was about to snap. Kane's face darkened, ego pricked raw by discipline he could not buy. And then, with deliberate arrogance, Gregory Kane lifted a polished shoe and stepped over the rope. The moment Gregory Kane's foot crossed the velvet rope, the atmosphere changed. Arlington had always felt like a place where time slowed, where silence was heavier than stone. But now silence cracked. Mothers pulled children closer. Veterans leaned forward, every instinct on edge. The crowd had come to watch honor embodied in boots and marble, not arrogance, strutting across sacred ground. Ethan Ward remained still, his rifle angled with flawless precision. His mirrored lenses reflected Kane's polished shoes grinding on the stone. A ripple went through the tourists like wind-bending grass. They knew this wasn't just disrespect, it was a violation. Laura Pierce's breath caught. She stepped quickly, heels clicking softly but urgently on the marble. "Sir, you cannot be here," she whispered, eyes darting to the growing stairs around them. "This is restricted." But Kane brushed her off with a sharp laugh. "Restricted? I own half the patents that run this country's security. My signature moves more markets than a senator's vote. Don't talk to me about restrictions," his voice carried, deliberately projecting to every ear within reach. Harris, the driver, shifted uncomfortably near the SUV. He tugged at his tie, looking at the ground. He had driven Kane long enough to know that when his boss smelled attention, he became louder, sharper, crueler. A woman in a red coat near the front whispered, "He's taunting him. He's pushing for a reaction." Her husband nodded grimly. He doesn't understand what he's playing with. James Holloway felt his chest tighten. He had seen battlefields desecrated by arrogance commanders who thought their rank gave them license to sneer at sacrifice. Claire clung to his arm. "Grandpa, why is he doing this?" she asked softly. James bent low voice, gravelly but steady. "Because he thinks money makes him bigger than duty." "He's wrong, Claire. Dead wrong." Ethan's boots did not move. His silence was iron, but his stillness radiated warning. The veterans in the crowd recognized it. Shoulders squared, jaws clenched, they saw in Ethan's stance the patience of a man who had stood calm under sniper fire, who had steadied others when chaos screamed. But Kane mistook silence for weakness. He smirked, pacing a half circle around Ethan. "Look at him. A wind-up toy. March left, march right. Any robot could do it. Hell, I could do it. But instead, taxpayers foot the bill for this." He waved a dismissive hand. "Pageant." Laura tried again, her voice urgent now. "Mr. Kane, please, enough. People are filming. This is not the place." Kane cut her off, eyes locked on Ethan. "Oh, I want them to film. Let the whole world see this. Tradition versus innovation. Stone versus silicon. Guess which one wins?" He lifted his phone again, snapping a selfie with Ethan in the background. The crowd murmured in outrage. "Shameful," an older woman muttered. A man in a veteran's cap spat on the ground. "He doesn't deserve to stand here." Little Tommy looked up at his father, confusion in his eyes. "Why doesn't the soldier stop him?" Ben swallowed hard, crouching down to his son's level. "Because real strength isn't about shouting back, son. It's about holding the line." Ethan's jaw flexed once, but his discipline held. The rifle gleamed across his chest, every angle immaculate. Kane leaned closer, eyes narrowed, voice dripping contempt. "You hear me, soldier boy? I've closed deals in rooms where presidents begged for my approval. My company's market cap is larger than half of NATO's GDP. And you're a prop." The words sliced the air. Gasps rose, a veteran in a wheelchair muttering, "Lord help him. He's crossed a line." James stepped forward unconsciously. Old instincts flooding back, but Claire clutched his sleeve tighter. "Grandpa, don't," she whispered. James froze. His eyes locked on Ethan, silently willing him strength. Kane smirked wider, emboldened. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a gold-plated pen, twirling it between his fingers. "Tell you what, soldier, I'll write a check right here, $1 million. Any veteran's charity you want. All you have to do is acknowledge me. Say it. Good afternoon, Mr. Kane." That's all. He raised his pen like it was Excalibur daring Ethan to take the bait. The crowd sucked in a collective breath. $1 million hung in the air like a poisoned apple. Parents explained in hushed tones, "It's not about money. He doesn't understand. You can't buy respect." Laura's face paled. "Sir," she hissed, "you're humiliating yourself." Kane ignored her. Stepping closer, polished shoes echoing on the sacred stone. He spread his arms dramatically, his Rolex glinting in the pale sunlight. "Come on, soldier boy. One word. That's all it takes. I'll wire it by noon. $1 million. Ethan's silence was absolute. Not even his breathing betrayed him, but the crowd saw it, the faintest tightening of his posture, the coiled calm of a man choosing patience over provocation. James's lips moved, whispering a prayer, and then Kane's voice rose higher, ego straining at Ethan's restraint. "Do you know who I am? I am Gregory Kane. I fund this country's future. I am the reason its lights turn on. You think you're guarding something important? You're nothing but a statue in my world." He took another step closer. Face flushed his shadow falling across Ethan's shoulder. That's when the soldier stopped. For the first time, Ethan broke his rhythm. Boots halted, rifle lowered by a fraction. And with a voice as steady as a mountain, Ethan Ward spoke. "Sir, this tomb honors the unknown who gave everything for this nation. You will step back, and you will show respect." The words cracked through the plaza like thunder. The crowd gasped, some with tears welling instantly. A woman clutched her chest, whispering, "He spoke." Gregory Kane blinked, his confidence shaken by the calm authority of those few words. For a moment, just a flicker, silence pressed him back. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Then his ego surged back like a tide. His voice rose, sneering. "Respect I fund this country. My taxes pay for your little parade." His hand shot out, sudden, violent, and struck Ethan across the face. The sound echoed across marble like a gunshot. The sound of that slap rolled across the plaza like thunder. Gasps burst from the crowd, sharp and horrified, echoing off the marble walls. For an instant, the cemetery, always reverent, felt like a battlefield charged with a single shocking act of violence. Ethan Ward did not move. His head had snapped slightly to the side with the impact, but when he turned back, his posture was as perfect as before. Rifle tight in his grip, shoulders square, jaw locked. Only the red bloom of a handprint stood out stark against his cheek, a mark that seemed to burn in the morning light. A young boy whimpered. Tommy buried his face in his father's coat. Ben wrapped his arm around his son's shoulders, eyes blazing with fury but voice steady. "It's all right, son. He's stronger than that man." James Holloway surged forward instinctively, his old muscles carrying him with surprising speed for a man in his 70s. Claire's voice broke with panic as she grabbed his sleeve. "Grandpa, no, no." Her flag shook in her hands. James froze, chest heaving, but his eyes stayed fixed on Ethan. He whispered, "Hold your ground, soldier." The crowd was no longer whispering, they were shouting. "You can't do that." A veteran in a wheelchair roared, fists clenched tight against the steel arms of his chair. "That's a soldier." Another voice, younger, pierced the noise. "Throw him out!" Parents covered their children's ears. Phones that had been raised for casual recording now dropped the moment too raw, too real for glass screens. Gregory Kane stood breathing heavily, his palms still tingling from the blow, a manic gleam in his gray eyes. He had expected retaliation, a flinch, a snapped command, maybe even physical restraint, but Ethan's stillness unnerved him. The guard did not respond. He only stared straight ahead, the mirrored lenses of his glasses reflecting back Kane's own twisted face. That silence cut deeper than any words. It told Kane and everyone else that his slap meant nothing. Laura Pierce's knees nearly buckled. Her iPad slipped slightly in her grip. "Sir," she hissed, her voice trembling with horror. "You assaulted him. This is criminal." Her professional mask was gone now, stripped bare by fear and shame. Kane wheeled on her, rage spilling over. "Don't lecture me, Laura. I built the empire that pays your salary. This—" He gestured wildly at Ethan. "This is a pageant, a pantomime, and I refuse to bow to it." The air turned heavier. The tourists stood stunned, but within seconds, 2 Arlington security officers emerged from the edge of the plaza. Their crisp uniforms and steady strides carried an authority that belonged only to those trained for moments exactly like this. The taller one, Officer Ramirez, closed in first. His voice was calm, level, but iron underneath. "Sir, step back. Now." Kane laughed sharply, defiance bubbling. "Step back. Do you know who I am?" The second officer. Sergeant Collins moved to flank him, already reaching for his wrist. "We know exactly who you are," Collins said. "And right now you're trespassing on restricted ground, and you just struck a service member on duty. That's assault." Gasps rose again, this time with approval. Parents nodded. Veterans muttered. Good children whispered to each other, eyes wide. But Kane was not finished, his face reddened, veins bulging. He tried to yank his arm free. "You can't touch me. My lawyers will bury you. I've dined with senators." Ethan's voice cut through the storm, steady and deliberate. Your meetings don't matter here. Your money doesn't matter here. The words landed with devastating clarity. Kane froze, momentarily robbed of speech. The crowd exhaled as though Ethan had just delivered a verdict. Harris, the driver, stood back near the SUV, his face drained of color. He pressed a trembling hand to his forehead, muttering under his breath, "God help us. He's finished." His phone was in his hand, already dialing the corporate legal team, but his eyes betrayed dread. Laura's hand shook as she gripped her iPad tighter. She stared at Ethan, seeing a man unmoved by all the things she had once believed mattered: wealth, status, power. For the first time, she questioned everything about the man she served. The officers tightened their hold on Kane. Ramirez's voice remained professional, but brooked no argument. "Sir, you're under arrest. Assault of a sentinel is a federal offense. You'll come with us." Kane thrashed, his voice breaking into a shout. "You can't. I am Gregory Kane. I own half of DC. I'll destroy you all." But his words rang hollow, now empty as coins spilling on stone. The crowd's shouts turned to cheers of support for Ethan, for silence, for the sacred line that money could not cross. Still, Ethan said nothing more. His head turned back, posture locking again into perfect form. The boots clicked once against marble, the rifle gleamed in the sunlight, and he resumed his march as if nothing had touched him. As if Kane's slap had never been more than a breeze against a mountain. Claire clutched her grandfather's sleeve, whispering, "Grandpa." He didn't even move. James's voice cracked, eyes shining with pride. "That's the strength of honor, Claire. That's what it looks like." And the plaza, though shaken, began to breathe again. The plaza pulsed with tension even after the officers seized Gregory Kane's arms. Some people in the crowd muttered angrily, others whispered to their children, but all eyes remained fixed on the marble platform where discipline and arrogance had collided. Ethan Ward's boots resumed their pattern, each click like a heartbeat returning to steady rhythm. His face, though marked by a vivid red handprint, betrayed no pain, no anger. He had endured worse in Syria: concussive blast, sniper fire, the chaos of ambush. Compared to those, one rich man's slap was a breeze across the surface of stone. But for the crowd, it had been seismic. Tommy peeked out from his father's coat. "Daddy," he whispered, "why didn't the soldier fight back?" Ben knelt again, gripping his son's shoulders. His voice was thick but sure. Because fighting back would have been about him. This is about the ones who never came home. He's guarding them, not himself. The boy nodded slowly. Flag crumpled in his small hand. He didn't fully understand, but something in his young heart recognized the gravity of what he'd just seen. Nearby, James Holloway stood stiffly, his chest swelling with pride and sorrow all at once. He had been in firefights where survival demanded action, but he had also learned the strength of restraint, the courage it took to stand unflinching. His granddaughter Claire looked up at him, her voice hushed but urgent. "Grandpa, does it hurt?" James's eyes stayed on Ethan's steady march. "It hurts, Claire, but not the way you think. That slap didn't break him. It proved him." The officers pulled Kane back toward the rope, but his voice still clawed for dominance. "You don't get it," he shouted, words tumbling over each other in desperation. "I am Gregory Kane. I fund innovation. I decide what future this country has. You think you can put your hands on me?" Sergeant Collins's grip was iron. "You assaulted a sentinel guarding the tomb of the unknown. Nothing else matters." Those words seemed to echo louder than Kane's protest, because the crowd straightened, some even nodding. A veteran in a baseball cap muttered, "Damn right." A woman with tears streaking her face whispered to her daughter, "Listen to that, honey. Remember it." Laura Pierce followed behind her iPad, pressed against her chest like a shield. Her mind swirled with disbelief. She had seen Kane destroy competitors with a sentence, silence, a boardroom with a glance. But here, against a soldier's silence, he was unraveling. For the first time, she wondered if she had tied her career to a man whose empire stood on sand. Harris, still by the SUV, wiped his palms on his trousers. His throat was dry. He thought about his own father, who had served in Vietnam, and how he would have looked at him with shame if he'd cheered Kane. Harris's voice broke in a whisper only he could hear. "Forgive me, Dad." Ethan marched on. The sound of his boots had never seemed louder. The cadence soothed the crowd, pulling them back from chaos. With every click, the plaza felt less like the site of a scandal and more like the sacred ground it had always been. But the echo of the slap lingered. It lingered in the way parents held their children tighter. It lingered in the way James's hand trembled on Claire's shoulder. It lingered in the way Laura could not tear her eyes from Ethan, her admiration growing with every disciplined step he took. Kane, however, refused to yield. His voice cracked half rage, half panic. "This isn't over. I'll buy this whole place if I have to. I'll turn it into a tech campus. You think you can humiliate me?" A ripple of disgust coursed through the onlookers. Someone shouted back, "You humiliated yourself." Others joined in, "Show respect. Get him out!" The anger of the crowd turned into a chorus, not wild or violent, but firm, unified, righteous. Ethan's march never faltered. He turned sharply, polished rifle shifting, shoulders, posture, flawless. For those who watched, it was as if his silence answered the crowd for him. The tomb was bigger than all of this, and he would not let one man diminish it. James whispered to Claire again, his voice low and reverent. "You're seeing history right now. Not the kind written in books, the kind lived in silence in the stand of one man who refuses to bow." Claire's eyes glistened. "I'll never forget," she said. Ramirez and Collins tightened their grip on Kane, pulling him closer to the SUV where official vehicles waited. Laura trailed reluctantly, torn between loyalty and shame. Harris avoided her gaze, his eyes downcast. The crowd began clapping, not for Kane's removal, but for Ethan. The sound started small, hesitant, but grew quickly. Veterans saluted from wheelchairs, children waved their little flags. The applause was not loud, but steady, a counterpoint to the soldiers' boots. And Ethan did not react. He simply marched on his duty unbroken. The applause slowly tapered into reverent silence, but the tension did not fully leave the air. Gregory Kane's voice, hoarse from shouting, still cut against the solemn backdrop. "You fools, do you even understand who you're dealing with?" His words scraped the marble like nails on glass. Sergeant Collins forced him toward the waiting vehicle, but Kane twisted his neck to keep his voice projected toward the crowd. "My company powers your lives, your phones, your networks, your jobs. It's all me. And you dare to treat me like a criminal?" "Officer." Ramirez stayed firm, his tone calm, but edged with steel. "Sir, you crossed the line the moment you raised your hand." The crowd murmured in agreement, heads nodding, jaws set. Kane's frantic insistence only made him smaller. Ethan Ward's march continued, his rifle gleaming under the pale autumn sun. His face remained an unreadable mask, though the red imprint still glowed on his cheek. The pain of the slap meant nothing. It was the desecration of duty that burned deeper, but even that Ethan buried beneath discipline. Tommy, still clutching his father's coat, whispered, "Daddy, why doesn't he stop talking?" Ben smoothed his son's hair. "Because when a man like that loses respect, words are all he has left." James Holloway took a slow breath, his weathered hands clenched behind his back. He remembered other men officers who barked orders but never understood sacrifice, politicians who smiled for cameras while soldiers bled in silence. He whispered to Claire, "Watch M. This is a lesson money can't buy." Claire's eyes never left Ethan. "He looks like stone," she murmured. James nodded, voice rough. "That's what honor looks like when it's tested." Kane, still writhing in the officer's grip, spat toward Ethan. "You think silence makes you strong? Say something to me. Acknowledge me." And then came his final gambit, shouted with manic pride. $1 million, right here. Any veterans charity you want. All you have to do is say, "Good afternoon, Mr. Kane." One word, soldier. One word, and the money is yours. The crowd gasped again. Shock and disgust colliding in the crisp air. Parents shook their heads. Veterans muttered curses under their breath. A woman's voice rang out clearly. "You can't buy respect." "Laura." Pierce's stomach turned. She wanted to sink into the stone beneath her feet. Her career, once built on Kane's shadow, now felt like chains. She whispered under her breath so softly that only she could hear, "You've lost everything, Gregory." Ethan paused mid-step. The plaza hushed breath held every eye watching. He turned just enough that the crowd could see the steady set of his jaw, the reflection of the CEO's twisted face in his sunglasses. His voice was low, even unshaken. This tomb isn't about money. It's about the ones who gave their lives for this country. Step back. It wasn't a plea. It was a command spoken with the authority of every soldier who had ever stood their ground. The crowd erupted, not in shouts this time, but in a wave of emotion. Some cried, others saluted. Claire clutched her flag to her chest, her eyes wet. Tommy's mouth fell open in awe. "Daddy?" He finally talked. Ben's voice trembled, and he said exactly what needed saying. Kane's face contorted. For the briefest moment, uncertainty flickered in his eyes, but ego surged back, drowning hesitation in rage. "Respect," he bellowed. "I fund this nation, I make the future." And then, before anyone could stop him, he jerked free from Collins's grasp with a sudden violent twist. He lunged forward, polished shoes scraping the stone, and crossed the last step into the tomb guard's path. His hand rose again, trembling not with fear, but with unbridled fury. The crowd screamed, some in outrage, some in fear. James shouted, "Don't you dare!" But Ethan did not move. His silence, his stillness, was a wall higher than marble, thicker than steel. Gregory Kane's hand slashed through the air again this time, not to slap, but to jab a finger into Ethan's chest. "I own this city," he roared. "I own you." The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. And Ethan, calm as ever, turned his head just slightly. His next words were quiet, but they fell like hammer strikes. "You own nothing here." The words, "You own nothing here," seemed to freeze the air. They weren't shouted, they weren't dramatic, but they landed with a weight that the crowd felt in their bones. It was as if Ethan Ward had spoken not only to Gregory Kane, but to every arrogant soul who had ever believed wealth could outweigh sacrifice. The plaza was silent. Even the rustle of autumn leaves seemed to pause. Parents held their children tighter. Veterans, some with trembling hands, gave subtle nods of approval. Claire's grip on James Holloway's arm tightened, her little flag pressed hard against her chest. "Grandpa," she whispered. "He told him." James's throat constricted. "Yes, Claire." He told him the truth. Kane staggered back half a step, Ethan's words striking deeper than the slap he had delivered moments ago. His gray eyes widened, not in fear but in disbelief, unaccustomed to being told no. Unaccustomed to being dismissed. Unaccustomed to being reminded that there were places where his reach meant nothing. Laura Pierce felt her own knees weaken. She had spent years watching Kane bulldoze competitors and silence critics with money and power. But here before the tomb of the unknown, she saw something she had never seen: a man stripped bare of influence. For the first time, she felt ashamed to be standing behind him. "Respect." Ethan continued, his voice calm, each syllable deliberate. "This ground honors those who gave everything. You will step back." The crowd let out a collective breath, almost like a prayer. A woman covered her mouth, tears streaming freely. A man whispered hoarsely, "God bless him." But Kane, red-faced and panting, could not let go of his pride. His voice rose louder, more erratic. "Respect. I demand respect. Do you know who I am? I am Gregory Kane. I've dined with presidents, I've reshaped industries. My company runs the infrastructure you all rely on. Without me, your lives collapse." He jabbed a finger again toward Ethan, spittle flying with each furious syllable. "And you standing there in silence? You think you're above me." The officers closed in again. Ramirez's voice level but firm. "That's enough, sir." Kane twisted violently, trying to wrench away his suit, rumpling as he shoved at Ramirez's arm. "Don't touch me. You'll regret this. Every one of you will regret this." Collins stepped in, gripping Kane's other arm with practiced precision. "Sir, you are trespassing on restricted ground, and you assaulted a sentinel. It's over." But Kane screamed louder, desperate to drown them out. "It's not over. I will bury you all in lawsuits. I'll buy every judge in this city. I'll see this guard stripped of his badge and begging for scraps." The crowd shouted back. Now their patience gone. "Get him out of here," a veteran roared. A young mother pulled her child close and yelled, "Show some dignity." Another man voice, shaking with outrage, shouted, You don't belong here, James Holloway's voice cut above them, low but powerful. Some men think money makes them untouchable. But it doesn't. Claire looked up at him wide-eyed. Then what does Grandpa? His gaze stayed locked on Ethan. Honor. Only honor. Kane thrashed, snarling honor. Doesn't pay bills. Honor doesn't build empires. At that, Ethan shifted his stance, deliberate, measured. His boots clicked once against the marble. He faced Kane fully rifle-held with flawless control. Behind his sunglasses, his gaze was a wall. This tomb, Ethan said quietly, is not for empires. It is for the nameless, for those who gave without asking and without expecting anything in return. He paused, letting the silence stretch. Your empire ends at this rope. The crowd erupted not with noise, but with a swell of emotion so strong it felt physical. Veterans saluted some with trembling hands. Parents explained in hushed voices. A boy whispered, "He's a hero." A woman clutched her husband's hand tighter, but Kane could not hear it. His ego roared louder than the crowd's reverence. He lunged again, voice breaking with fury. "You will acknowledge me." And then he did the unthinkable. His arm swung once more, aiming another slap at Ethan's face. Gasps tore through the plaza. James stepped forward, fury blazing, but Claire held him back with a desperate cry. "Grandpa, don't!" Ethan stood still. He had faced mortars and machine guns. This was nothing. The blow landed the sound like another crack of thunder across the marble. The red mark deepened on his cheek. Still, Ethan did not break posture. His silence screamed louder than Kane's rage. The crowd, however, had reached its breaking point. Veterans shouted. Parents cried out. A man's voice rang across the plaza. "Arrest him now." The officers seized Kane more forcefully this time, wrenching his arms behind him. Ramirez's voice cut sharp as steel. "Gregory Kane, you are under arrest." The words landed like the closing of a door Kane could not reopen. The crowd broke into a chorus of voices, shouts of outrage, cries for justice, the raw sound of people witnessing something they never thought they would see at Arlington. Some lifted their phones again, not for spectacle, but for evidence. Others simply stood frozen, their hands over their mouths, stunned into silence by the audacity of what had just happened. Ethan Ward remained still, posture perfect, his rifle steady, though the imprint of Gregory Kane's second strike flamed brighter against his cheek. His sunglasses hid his eyes, but those who had served recognized the set of his shoulders, the stillness of a soldier who refused to surrender his dignity no matter the insult. His silence was louder than any retaliation could have been. Gregory Kane, however, could not stop himself. Even as Ramirez and Collins clamped his wrists and began pulling him back toward the edge of the restricted plaza, his voice carried shrill and furious. "This isn't over. Do you hear me? I will own this place. I will bulldoze this marble and put a data center here. You'll beg me for jobs when I'm finished." The crowd erupted again, now openly hostile. A veteran in a wheelchair pounded his fist against the armrest. "You disgrace!" he shouted. A woman with tears streaming down her cheeks called out, "You can't buy what they gave." A father raised his voice for his children to hear. "Remember this, kids. Money can't buy respect." Ben's voice cracked as he bent down to Tommy. "What you're seeing, son, is a man who thinks wealth is power. But real power," he pointed toward Ethan's still figure, "is standing for something bigger than yourself." Tommy nodded slowly, eyes locked on Ethan, the boy's small chest rising with pride instead of fear now. James Holloway stepped forward another inch, his weathered face a battlefield of anger and reverence. His hand trembled as he saluted Ethan, though Ethan's gaze never broke from the eternal line of his march. Claire clung to his sleeve, whispering, "Grandpa, why doesn't he hit back?" James's voice came rough, thick with emotion. "Because that soldier isn't guarding himself, Claire. He's guarding every nameless soul who never came home." The officers dragged Kane farther back, but his protests grew louder, desperate, unhinged. "You can't arrest me. Do you know who I am? I am Gregory Kane. My company's worth more than half the countries you salute." His voice cracked, spit flecking his lips. The mask of corporate control stripped away. Laura Pierce's face was pale. her hands trembling as she tried to keep hold of her iPad. The screen had gone black, but she hardly noticed. For years she had believed Kane's aura of power was unshakable. Now seeing him shrieking like a cornered animal before the silent strength of a single soldier, she felt something crumble inside her. Shame, sharp and undeniable, clawed up her chest. Harris, the driver, stood stiff by the SUV, his phone pressed to his ear. He whispered rapidly to the corporate legal team, but his voice faltered. He had been loyal for years, enduring Kane's temper, his arrogance. But today on these sacred stones, Harris's stomach churned with disgust. He thought of his father's medals tucked in a box at home. He thought of how ashamed his father would be if he saw him serving a man who dared slap a sentinel. The crowd's voices built again this time. Not in outrage alone, but in defense. A man in uniform shouted clearly, "That guard has earned the right to silence you." Another voice rang out, "Duty before dollars." The chant caught quickly, rippling through the people. Duty before dollars, duty before dollars. It rolled across the plaza like a wave rising stronger than Kane's screams. Ethan didn't flinch. He resumed his march boots striking marble with metronomic precision. His body moved as if untouched, as if the insults and strikes were nothing compared to the oath he lived. His silence, his rhythm, became the crowd's anchor. Ramirez leaned into Kane's ear, his voice cutting through the CEO's ranting. "You will leave this ground in custody. You assaulted a soldier at the tomb of the unknown. No amount of money will erase that." Kane thrashed once more, but Collins locked his arms tighter, snapping restraints over his wrists. The metallic click echoed like a verdict. The crowd roared with approval. Claire pressed closer to James, her eyes wide. "Grandpa, they're taking him away." James's eyes glistened. "They are. Because no man, no matter how rich, is bigger than this duty." Ben lifted Tommy in his arms so the boy could see above the crowd. Tommy's small voice carried clearly. "He's a hero, Daddy. That soldier's a hero." Ben's throat tightened as he kissed his son's head. "Yes, Tommy, he is. Not because he fought back, but because he didn't have to." Ethan turned sharply. Boots clicking, rifle snapping to the other shoulder. The rhythm resumed, each step louder, steadier, as though stitching the torn dignity of the moment back together. And Gregory Kane, bound and shouting, was dragged past the rope toward the waiting security vehicle, his empire echoing hollow against the silence of honor. The clatter of Gregory Kane's protests trailed across the plaza as the officers marched him toward the edge. His words spilled in furious fragments, but the crowd no longer flinched. They had seen enough. His voice, once booming with confidence, now rang with desperation. "You'll regret this, all of you. I'll buy every lawyer in D.C. I'll bury this place in lawsuits." His face flushed crimson, spit gathering at the corners of his mouth. His manic struggle more pitiful than powerful. Ethan Ward, by contrast, moved like clockwork. 21 steps, pause, rifle shifted with surgical precision. The red mark still burned on his cheek, but his body was a fortress. With every step he reclaimed the silence Kane had tried to shatter. Each click of his boots was a reminder. Discipline doesn't bend for arrogance. The applause that had surged earlier began again, steadier now, a tide of support building behind Ethan. Veterans saluted, some with trembling arms. Children waved their flags. Tourists, once unsure whether to raise phones, lowered them completely, realizing they were witnessing something not meant for screens but for memory. James Holloway's salute stayed firm, his shoulders squared though his joints ached with age. Claire watched him with wide eyes, clutching her flag so tightly it bent. "Grandpa," she whispered, "why are you saluting him?" James's voice shook but held strong. "Because he deserves it, Em. That man's carrying more than his own honor. He's carrying theirs, the ones who never came home." Claire blinked up at Ethan, her throat tight. "I'll remember this forever." Nearby, Ben held Tommy in his arms. The boy's eyes were glued to Ethan. "Daddy?" He didn't even hit back. Not once. Ben kissed his son's hair, his own eyes wet. "That's the point, Tommy. Real strength isn't about lashing out. It's about standing firm." The officers shoved Kane past the velvet rope. Ramirez's tone never wavered. "Sir, you've assaulted a sentinel. That alone is a crime that will follow you for the rest of your life." Kane thrashed in their grip wrists, bound now in steel cuffs. You think this ends here? I'll own your pensions. I'll own your homes. I'll buy this cemetery if I want. His words sounded hollow, a tantrum echoing in the sacred quiet. Laura Pierce followed at a distance, her heels dragging against the marble. She stared at Kane no longer with loyalty, but with disbelief. She had built her career around his empire, had defended his arrogance in boardrooms, but watching him unravel in front of a soldier's silence shattered something inside her. Her chest tightened with a shame that felt suffocating. For the first time, she thought, I cannot follow this man any longer. Harris, the driver, lowered his phone slowly. His call to the corporate legal team had connected, but he couldn't form the words. His father's medals flashed in his mind, and he felt bile rise in his throat. He muttered under his breath, I should have left years ago. The crowd pressed closer to the rope, but no one dared cross it. They understood instinctively that the space around Ethan was hallowed. Even in the chaos, the tomb stood untouched, marble gleaming under the morning sun. Autumn leaves drifted across the plaza, catching the light as they fell. And still, Ethan marched. His boots echoed like a drumbeat, anchoring the crowd in a rhythm older than any corporate empire, older than the man screaming at the officers. James leaned down to Claire, his voice breaking but resolute. This is what it means to hold the line, M. This is what duty looks like when tested. Claire whispered, I want to be like him. James swallowed hard, his hand squeezing her shoulder. Then remember this moment. Remember that silence can be stronger than a shout, that respect can outlast money. The officers dragged Kane to the waiting security vehicle, his curses thinning, his voice cracking from strain. A hush rippled through the crowd as they watched the once powerful billionaire reduced to a flailing, shouting man bound in handcuffs. One woman whispered to her husband, I'll never forget this. Not for as long as I live. The husband nodded. Neither will I. Our kids will tell their kids about the day a tomb guard showed the world what honor means. Ethan pivoted sharply, rifle snapping to his other shoulder. The rhythm resumed 21 steps, pause, turn. The sound of his boots drowned out Kane's final shouts. For the first time since the slap piece returned to the plaza. The piece settling back over the plaza carried weight like the hush after thunder. Gregory Kane's shouts, once shrill and piercing, grew faint as the officers dragged him farther toward the waiting vehicle. Each step away seemed to peel his power from him, leaving only the raw spectacle of a man undone. Do you know who I am? He cried again, though his voice cracked on the words. I'm Gregory Kane. I own half of Washington. I'll have your badges by sundown. His threat sputtered against the calm authority of Sergeant Collins, who held him firm. You've crossed the line, sir, Collins said, his voice measured, almost gentle in its finality. And there's no money that buys your way back. The crowd murmured their agreement. Some clapped softly. Others stood in silence, hands over hearts, not out of ritual but instinct. It felt as though they had witnessed something larger than an arrest. They had witnessed arrogance meet its limit. Ethan Ward continued his march. The crimson handprint on his cheek burned in the pale light, but his composure did not falter. His boots clicked against marble, his rifle gleamed, his every motion flawless. The discipline of the tomb guard was not just training, it was conviction. Laura Pierce lingered near the edge of the crowd, her iPad now dangling uselessly at her side. Her eyes stayed locked on Ethan. She thought of the years she had spent serving Kane's demands, defending his ego, smoothing over his offenses. And now in one moment it all seemed absurd. She whispered under her breath, He looks stronger than any man I've ever worked for. Harris, standing near the SUV, avoided looking at his employer. His phone still buzzed faintly in his pocket from the legal team's missed call, but he didn't answer. His gaze drifted to Ethan, and for the first time in years, Harris felt a pang of pride, not for the man he worked for, but for the man he had just seen endure humiliation without breaking. Ben placed Tommy back on the ground, kneeling so his son could see him eye to eye. Tommy, do you understand what happened? The boy nodded slowly, his brow furrowed with thought. The rich man tried to buy him, then he hit him, but the soldier didn't move. Ben smiled faintly, tears welling. That's right, because some things can't be bought, and the soldier showed him that. Tommy's little voice was soft but certain. That soldier's braver than the man who hit him. Across the plaza, James Holloway finally let his salute fall. His hand trembled as it lowered, but his eyes remained fixed on Ethan. Claire leaned close, whispering, "Grandpa, why did everyone get so mad?" James's voice came slow, heavy with memory. "Because we all know men like that, men who think money makes them kings." But here he gestured toward the tomb. "This ground belongs to the nameless. It belongs to sacrifice, not to arrogance." Claire nodded solemnly. "I think I understand." The crowd parted as Ramirez and Collins escorted Kane to the waiting security vehicle. His shouts had dwindled into ragged sputters. "This isn't over. You'll all pay for this." But even his assistant no longer looked at him with respect. Laura's face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her silence was its own judgment. When the car door slammed shut behind Kane, the sound reverberated across the plaza. A collective exhale swept through the onlookers. The storm had passed. Ethan marched on, unbroken. His silence filled the void Kane's departure left behind. Every step seemed to stitch back the dignity the SLAP had tried to tear away. A veteran in a baseball cap raised his voice. "That uniform isn't just cloth. It's earned. And today he showed us why." The crowd nodded, some clapping softly again, some bowing their heads. Laura closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, her chest tightening with shame and awe. She whispered, "I've followed the wrong man for too long." The rhythm of Ethan's boots carried over the plaza, sharp and steady. 21 steps, pause, turn. The rifle shifted shoulders. The mark on his cheek was visible still, but his bearing was untouched. To the crowd, it was clear Kane had been diminished, but Ethan had not. The slam of the security vehicle door echoed like punctuation the closing of a chapter the crowd had just lived through. Gregory Kane's furious cries were muffled now, sealed behind glass and steel. The once proud billionaire, who minutes before had strutted across the sacred stone like he owned the world, was reduced to a red-faced figure, clawing at the tinted window as the officers buckled him into his seat. The crowd didn't cheer as he was driven away. They didn't need to. The sight of him being hauled off in cuffs said more than applause ever could. Instead, they turned their eyes back to the man who had stood silently through it all. Ethan Ward, cheeks flushed with the mark of a slap boot steady rifle gleaming, resumed his eternal march as though nothing had happened. James Holloway swallowed hard. He had seen enough commanders buckle under pressure, enough men cave when tested to recognize the magnitude of what Ethan had done. "Look at him, Claire," he murmured, his voice catching. "He didn't move an inch. That's strength they'll never teach in boardrooms." Claire's eyes glistened. "He looks like he's not even hurt." James's voice grew softer. "Oh, he's hurt, sweetheart. But pain is small compared to duty. He knows the tomb isn't about him. It's about the ones who can't stand here themselves." Nearby, Ben knelt again beside Tommy. The boy still clutched his small flag, his face pale with awe. "Daddy, will people remember this day?" Ben's eyes stayed on Ethan, whose boots struck the marble in flawless cadence. "Yes, son. People will remember. Not because of the man who shouted, but because of the soldier who didn't." The plaza was quieter now, though the murmurs hadn't vanished. Parents explained softly to children. Veterans shook their heads with both pride and sorrow, and tourists who had once held up phones now tucked them away as if the moment was too sacred to digitize. Laura Pierce stood apart, her iPad clutched loosely against her chest. Her face had lost its usual sharp composure. Shame weighed heavy on her shoulders, but alongside it stirred something new, admiration. She whispered almost to herself, "He made Victor look small without saying a word." The slip of her tongue calling Kane by his first name instead of Mr. Kane was a sign she no longer viewed him as untouchable. Harris leaned against the SUV, his tie loosened, his phone forgotten in his pocket. He couldn't shake the image of his father's medals the way the old man used to polish them each Memorial Day. He thought of how disgusted his father would have been to see him serve a man who struck a sentinel. Harris muttered to no one in particular, "I think I'm done." Ethan pivoted sharply, rifle snapping across his chest boots, landing in unison. His movement was perfection. The crowd straightened subconsciously, as if his discipline commanded their own posture. Some veterans saluted again, others simply stood taller. The rhythm of his march recentered the plaza, and then from somewhere near the back, an older woman's voice broke the silence. "That uniform isn't a costume. That man earned the right to stand there." Heads turned toward her, She stood next to a veteran in a wheelchair, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. He raised a trembling hand to salute Ethan. The woman continued, her voice firm. My husband fought in Korea. He always said, discipline is stronger than violence. Today, I understand. Tears welled in the eyes of many who listened. A young mother crouched beside her daughter, whispering, that soldier stood for more than himself. That's why we respect this place. The child nodded, clutching her tiny flag. James took a step forward, his voice carrying over the quiet crowd. That man you saw screaming, he thought money could buy reverence. But it can't. What we just saw, he gestured toward Ethan, is why honor outlives arrogance. The crowd murmured in agreement. Some clapped again softly, reverently. Laura wiped her eyes, startled to find them wet. She whispered, all this time I thought strength was about power. But it's this silence. Harris straightened his decision firm now. He whispered under his breath, I quit. First thing tomorrow. As Kane's vehicle disappeared beyond the gates, his voice gone from the plaza, the cemetery returned to its true rhythm, the echo of boots, the rustle of leaves, the silence of sacrifice. Ethan did not falter. The handprint on his cheek remained, but it seemed less a mark of humiliation than a badge of endurance. He was not broken. If anything, he stood taller. And for everyone watching, it became clear Gregory Kane had been diminished forever. But Ethan Ward's silent sentinel of the unknown had only grown larger. The black SUV carrying Gregory Kane disappeared down Memorial Avenue, swallowed by the line of trees and the reverent hush of Arlington. For a long moment after no one spoke, the plaza seemed to reclaim itself, silence rushing back in like a tide returning to shore. Ethan Ward continued his measured march, boots striking stone with precision that cut through the stillness. The rhythm steadied, the onlookers reminded them that nothing, no insult, no slap, no outburst could disturb the eternal duty carried out before the tomb of the unknown soldier. The crimson handprint still blazed across his cheek, but to those who watched it no longer looked like shame. It looked like proof of resilience, proof that honor could not be bought or broken. James Holloway lowered his hand slowly from another salute. His eyes shone, though he tried to blink away the sting. He's stronger than I've ever seen, he muttered, almost to himself. Claire tugged at his sleeve. Grandpa, why didn't he fight back? He's a soldier. He could have stopped that man. James knelt, bringing his weathered face level with hers. Because this fight wasn't about fists, Em. It was about standing still. Sometimes the hardest thing a soldier can do is nothing because his duty demands more than his pride. Claire's small voice quivered. I'll remember that. Nearby Ben crouched beside Tommy again, his voice hushed. Do you understand now, son? Tommy nodded slowly, his flag still clutched tightly. He didn't hit back, because he's protecting the tomb, not himself. Ben's throat tightened. He hugged his boy. That's right, and that's what makes him a hero. Around them, the crowd shifted, murmuring quietly. A woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. A man whispered to his wife, I've lived in D.C. for 20 years. I've never seen anything like this. Another veteran leaned on his cane, shaking his head. That billionaire will fade into the news cycle by tomorrow. But this soldier's silence, people will talk about it for years. Laura Pierce stood apart, arms folded tightly, iPad hanging useless at her side. She couldn't tear her eyes from Ethan. Everything she thought she knew about strength and power had been upended in a single morning. She whispered, It wasn't Kane who looked powerful today. It was him. Harris leaned against the hood of the SUV. His tie loosened, sweat damp on his brow. He shook his head, muttering, My father was right. Men like Kane fall fast when they hit real steel. He watched Ethan's measured steps, a strange mixture of guilt and admiration flooding him. The applause started again, this time softer, steadier, less of a roar and more of a tribute. Parents guided children to wave their little flags. Veterans saluted. Some bowed their heads in prayer. The noise wasn't raucous. It was reverent, like an offering given to the silence Ethan carried. But Ethan did not react. His boots struck the stone 21 steps, pause, turn. His rifle gleamed under the autumn light. His silence was complete, unbroken, as though Kane's outburst had never happened. James straightened, putting an arm around Claire's shoulders. Remember this, M. It's not the man shouting who defines the day. It's the man who stands tall when others try to tear him down. Claire nodded, her young eyes fixed on Ethan, her heart recording every detail she knew she'd carry forever. Ben lifted Tommy again so he could see better. The boy leaned against his father's shoulder, whispering, "Daddy, can we come back here again?" Ben kissed his son's hair, voice thick. "Yes, son, we'll come back. And every time we do, we'll remember what we saw today." As the sun climbed higher, its light spread across the cemetery's endless rows of headstones. White marble glowed like silent sentinels themselves, each one echoing the discipline embodied by Ethan's march. Laura finally exhaled a long, shaky breath. She turned toward Harris, her voice low. "I think this is the end for me. I can't keep working for a man like Kane." Harris met her eyes surprised, then nodded slowly. "You're not the only one thinking that." The crowd lingered, unwilling to leave, as though stepping away would diminish the weight of what they had just seen. They whispered, they saluted, they explained to their children. But above all, they listened to the steady click of boots, the eternal rhythm that anchored the sacred ground. And Ethan Ward marched on his silence, unyielding his presence, a reminder the tomb was not guarded for him. It was guarded for the ones who never came home. The minutes that followed felt timeless, as if the plaza itself had slipped into a different rhythm. Gregory Kane was gone, but the imprint of what had happened lingered in the chilled air, carried in the red mark on Ethan Ward's cheek and the heavy silence that wrapped around every spectator. Ethan's boots clicked in their relentless pattern. 21 steps, pause, pivot rifle, shifting shoulders. Each movement was a declaration. The man who had endured battlefield ambushes, who had earned his silver star in the Syrian desert, had once again proven that honor doesn't crack under pressure. His silence carried louder than Kane's shouting ever could. James Holloway's gaze stayed locked on Ethan. His thoughts slipped back to decades earlier, to the islands of the Pacific, where his own squad had been pinned down under fire. He remembered the captain who stood tall, not because he shouted orders, but because he didn't flinch when chaos tried to break them. That same stillness, that same unshakable core, lived in Ethan now. James's throat tightened, and he whispered to Claire, "That's what I saw once before, and it saved lives." Claire leaned against him, her small hand squeezing his. "I'll never forget this, Grandpa. Never." Nearby, Ben crouched beside Tommy again. The boy's eyes were wide, his little flag limp in his hand. "Daddy," he whispered, "that man in the suit." He looked weak when he yelled, but the soldier, he looked strong when he was quiet. Ben smiled faintly, brushing his son's hair back. "You've got it, son. That's a lesson most grown-ups don't understand. Sometimes strength is in the silence." A veteran in a wheelchair rolled closer to the rope, his hands trembling. His voice cracked as he called out toward Ethan. "Thank you, son, for standing for them, for all of us." The words hung in the air, raw and reverent. Others in the crowd nodded, some wiping tears. A woman whispered, "I came here to teach my kids history, but we just lived it." Laura Pierce shifted uncomfortably, shame pressing heavier on her chest with each passing minute. She thought of the years she had spent following Kane, smoothing over his arrogance, hiding his sins. For the first time, she saw clearly everything she had done in service to him was hollow. By contrast, one soldier's silence carried more meaning than all Kane's speeches combined. Harris stood stiffly near the SUV, hands in his pockets, avoiding everyone's eyes. He muttered half to himself, "My dad would have stood and saluted too." The guilt gnawed at him, but alongside it stirred something else, respect. The applause rose again, this time steadier, less emotional release and more tribute. Parents encouraged children to clap, veterans raised salutes, tourists bowed their heads. The sound wasn't loud, but it filled the space with a unity that Kane's noise had tried and failed to break. And still Ethan did not acknowledge them. He turned sharply, boots striking, rifle snapping with flawless precision. His silence was not cold, it was reverent. He wasn't there to receive admiration, he was there to guard the nameless, to ensure that those who gave everything would never be forgotten. James placed a hand on Claire's shoulder. "Remember this, Em. Remember it when people try to tell you respect can be bought. Remember that it can't." Claire nodded, her lips pressed tight. "I'll tell my friends. I'll tell everyone." Ben hugged Tommy tighter, lifting him so the boy could see clearly over the crowd. Tommy's young face was serious now. "Daddy, he's marching for people who don't even have names." Ben's voice broke. "That's right, son, and that's what makes him a hero." The wind picked up slightly, rustling through the rows of white headstones stretching into the distance. The autumn leaves swirled glowing gold against the pale marble. For those watching, it felt like the cemetery itself was nodding in agreement, bearing witness to the moment. Laura's eyes brimmed with tears. She tried to blink away. She whispered again, almost like a vow to herself, "I can't follow Kane anymore. Not after this." Harris gave a small, humorless laugh beside her. "You're not alone in that." Slowly the crowd began to thin, though many lingered, reluctant to step away from the sacredness of what they had seen. Parents spoke softly to children. Veterans clasped one another's hands, and still the rhythm of Ethan's boots anchored them all. He marched not for applause, not for recognition, but for the unknown who could no longer march themselves. And in his silence, everyone there learned what Gregory Kane never could honor is unshakable, and it cannot be bought. As the plaza settled into its steady rhythm once more, the crowd's awe did not wane. People lingered as if tethered by something they couldn't quite name. The truth was simple. They had come as tourists, but they were leaving as witnesses. Ethan Ward's march continued unbroken. The red welt on his cheek remained, but his bearing had not shifted by so much as a hair. Every step he took said what no words could. His oath was stronger than insult, stronger than pride. James Holloway exhaled his breath, shuddering. He had spent years explaining honor to those who hadn't lived it, but today he didn't need to explain. The soldier before them was a living definition. He turned to Claire. "You saw something special today, Em. Something most people never see with their own eyes." Claire's young voice was soft, but sure. "I want to be like him, strong like that." James squeezed her hand. "Then remember this day. Remember that strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, and it stands when others try to tear it down." Nearby, Ben shifted Tommy on his hip. The boy's small fingers clutched his flag tighter than ever. "Daddy," he asked. "Did the man in the suit lose?" Ben smiled faintly, his eyes wet. "Yes, Tommy, he lost everything today. Not because anyone hit him back, but because he showed the whole world that money can't buy respect." Tommy nodded slowly, a lesson rooting itself deep. Across the plaza, Laura Pierce stood rigid, her knuckles white against the edge of her iPad. Shame coiled tight in her chest. She had defended Kane's arrogance in meetings, excused his cruelty to subordinates, even turned a blind eye when he bulldozed people with lawsuits. But here, in front of a silent soldier and a crowd that knew truth when they saw it, she felt stripped of excuses. Her throat tightened, and before she could stop herself, she whispered aloud, "I can't keep working for him." Harris glanced at her. His own face, pale jaw clenched. For a moment he said nothing. Then he nodded slowly, his voice gravelly. "Neither can I." Laura's eyes brimmed with tears. "He made himself small today, smaller than I ever thought possible. And that soldier," her voice broke, "he made everything Kane ever boasted about look meaningless." Harris swallowed hard, staring at Ethan's steady form. "That man hasn't said 10 words, and he's stronger than every boardroom I've ever seen." The crowd murmured softly, reverently. A woman near the front leaned to her husband. "Do you see it? That mark on his cheek? It's not humiliation, it's proof." Her husband nodded. Proof that he stood, proof that he didn't bend. Applause rose again, gentler now, almost like a prayer. Parents encouraged their children to clap. Veterans lifted trembling salutes. Yet Ethan never acknowledged them. His silence was the answer, his march the eternal reply. James raised his chin, his voice carrying over the hushed plaza. "He's not guarding for us to cheer. He's guarding for the ones who never came home. That's what makes this sacred." Claire's lip trembled as she whispered, "I think they'd be proud of him." James's eyes glistened. "They would, I guarantee it." Laura pressed her trembling hands against her face, struggling to compose herself. She had always believed in control and composure, but now watching Ethan's silence overshadow Kane's empire, she realized she had been chasing shadows for years. For the first time, she felt admiration not for the man who signed her paychecks, but for the sentinel who refused to sell his voice. Harris stepped forward, his shoes scuffing lightly against the stone. He muttered to Laura, "After today, I'll never drive that man again. Laura lowered her hands, her expression carved with a new resolve. I'll never work for him again. Together they stood at the edge of the plaza watching Ethan march, knowing that their lives, though different from the soldiers, would change because of what they had witnessed. The sun broke through the thinning clouds, scattering gold across the marble tomb. Leaves drifted down like fragments of memory, glowing briefly before settling on the stone. And Ethan's boots clicked on steady and unshaken. The sun climbed higher, burning away the last of the mist. Its light fell across Arlington's rolling hills, each white headstone gleaming like a note in an eternal hymn. The crowd lingered still, reluctant to leave. They had come expecting a quiet ceremony, a ritual of honor. Instead, they had seen arrogance tested against silence, and silence had prevailed. Ethan Ward remained the axis of the scene. 21 steps, pause, pivot. The rifle shifted with machine-like precision. Yet to those watching, every click of his boots was more than mechanics. It was defiance against corruption, discipline against ego, honor against wealth. The red welt on his cheek seemed carved into stone, not a mark of weakness, but of endurance. James Holloway stood tall beside Claire, his breath visible in the crisp autumn air. He had fought, bled, and carried brothers off battlefields. But even so, this moment struck him differently. His voice dropped low, as if confiding to the dead who lay beneath the marble. They'd be proud of him, he murmured. Claire squeezed his hand, whispering, I'm proud of him too, Grandpa. Nearby, Ben rubbed Tommy's back, the boy leaning against his father's chest. Tommy's small voice was thoughtful. Daddy, why didn't the soldier say more? Ben smiled faintly. Because sometimes, son, fewer words are stronger. He said exactly enough. The rest he showed with his steps. The boy nodded, eyes wide, like a drumbeat. The applause had subsided, replaced by quiet reverence. People shifted only to wipe their eyes or adjust their grips on small flags. Tourists who had once aimed for snapshots now let their cameras dangle, realizing that some things were not meant to be captured in pixels, but etched into memory. Laura Pierce couldn't tear her gaze from Ethan. Every detail burned into her mind: the polished rifle, the flawless march, the refusal to break even when struck. She had defended Kane for years, made excuses for his arrogance. But now, watching Ethan guard the nameless with such devotion, she felt her own excuses dissolve. Her voice cracked in a whisper meant only for herself. I've been standing behind the wrong man all along. Harris heard her, though she hadn't meant for him to. His jaw tightened. Same here, he muttered. All these years driving him around like he was untouchable. And here one soldier made him look small. Laura exhaled sharply, her eyes wet. Not with fists, not with shouting, just by standing. Harris nodded, the guilt in his chest, tempered with newfound clarity. My dad used to tell me silence can be the loudest answer. I didn't get it until now. The wind picked up, rustling through the golden leaves. One leaf drifted onto the marble tomb, settling gently on its smooth surface. The crowd seemed to notice at once, as if nature itself had bowed. A woman whispered, It's like the earth is saluting him. Ethan pivoted again, rifle snapping boots ringing steady against the stone. The sound was hypnotic, anchoring everyone in place. No one dared break the rhythm with careless chatter. James cleared his throat, his voice carrying softly but firmly. All my life I've heard people brag about what they've built, what they've bought. But none of that lasts. What lasts is this duty. Silence. Honor. Claire pressed closer to him. Grandpa, do you think I'll always remember this? James smiled faintly, his eyes still wet. I know you will. And when you're older, you'll tell your kids. That's how honor lives on. The crowd gradually began to drift through. Many paused for one last look. Parents bent down to whisper lessons. Veterans offered quiet salutes. Children clutched their flags with new reverence. Laura and Harris remained rooted, unwilling to leave just yet. Laura whispered, Tomorrow, my resignation is on his desk. Harris exhaled slowly. And I'll hand in my keys. Their eyes stayed on Ethan, on the soldier who had silently changed their lives. As the crowd thinned, the plaza felt restored. The tomb glowed in the full light of day. Ethan's march continued, the red mark on his cheek fading slowly, but his posture never faltering. For those who had witnessed it, the lesson was branded into memory. Honor cannot be bought. Respect cannot be forced. and silence, when chosen with courage, can echo louder than 1,000 shouts. By midday, the cemetery had resumed its rhythm. Yet the memory of what had happened spread like fire through whispers, phone calls, and the first flickers of media alerts pinging in pockets. Gregory Kane, billionaire CEO, arrested for striking a tomb guard. Even before the news vans rolled toward the gates, people already knew this story would travel far beyond Arlington. But Ethan Ward's boots did not waver. 21 steps, pause, pivot rifle across the chest. His bearing was the same as it had been that morning before Kane's intrusion. The only difference was the faint outline still visible on his cheek, a mark that told a different kind of story. Not one of humiliation, but of endurance. James Holloway exhaled slowly, his weathered face reflecting both grief and pride. "That man's world is going to collapse," he murmured half to himself. Claire tilted her head up, clutching his sleeve. The rich man James nodded. "Yes, men like him live on power and attention. When the world sees what he did today, it'll strip him bare." Claire's brow furrowed. "But the soldier didn't even fight him." James smiled faintly. "That's why it matters." The soldier didn't need to. His silence did the fighting for him. Nearby, Ben adjusted Tommy on his hip. The boy's voice was small, but clear. "Daddy, will the man go to jail?" Ben hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Maybe. But what's certain is he'll never escape what people saw today. His money can't erase this." Tommy thought for a moment. "So the soldier won?" Ben hugged his son close. "Yes, he won without ever lifting a hand." The crowd, though thinning, had shifted into a quiet reverence. Veterans spoke in hushed tones, some recalling battles of their own. A woman whispered to her husband, "I didn't realize until today what this place really meant." Her husband nodded. "Neither did I. It's not just a ceremony, it's a promise." Laura Pierce checked her phone out of habit, and sure enough, notifications swarmed the screen. News sites were already posting headlines, "CEO arrested for assaulting tomb guard." Arlington ceremony disrupted by billionaire outburst. Stock tickers for Kane's company flickered red. She closed the device, a bitter taste rising in her mouth. She whispered, "It's starting already." Harris leaned beside her, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "His empire won't survive this, and you know what? It shouldn't." He stared at Ethan, his voice lower now. This soldier did more in silence than Kane ever did with all his shouting. Laura's throat tightened. She whispered, "He's the only one who looked powerful today." The applause began again, not spontaneous this time, but deliberate. People clapped slowly, reverently, the sound rolling across the plaza like a tide of gratitude. Veterans saluted. Parents guided children's hands into small claps. The rhythm was steady, like the echo of Ethan's boots. But Ethan did not acknowledge them. He marched, pivoted, marched again. His silence was complete, his focus unbroken. It was never about applause. It was about the tomb. James's voice broke as he spoke softly to Claire. "You just watched a man prove that some values cannot be bought, no matter how much money a man throws." Claire nodded, her eyes wet. "He's stronger than the man in the suit ever was." The sun angled across the plaza, lighting the tomb in a glow that seemed almost ethereal. Leaves continued to fall golden against the marble, like a silent tribute. Reporters began gathering at the gates, their cameras heavy, their voices clipped. But inside the rope, none of that mattered. The world outside could spin its stories. Here Ethan's boots told the only story that counted. Laura and Harris remained where they stood, transfixed. Harris muttered, "Tomorrow I'm walking away from him." Laura nodded firmly. "Me too." The crowd lingered, reluctant to leave, as though they feared stepping away would make the lesson fade. Yet, deep inside, every person knew it wouldn't. The lesson was already etched in them. Ethan Ward marched on his silence, unshaken, his oath unbroken. The cemetery's gates began to hum with activity. Reporters gathered in small knots, phones pressed to their ears, cameras hoisted to shoulders. News of Gregory Kane's arrest had spread like lightning. But inside the plaza, none of that frenzy touched Ethan Ward. His boots still struck marble with surgical precision, his rifle shifting across his chest in flawless rhythm. Those who had been present knew the truth already. The story wasn't Kane's arrest. The story was the soldier who had stood in silence, bearing insult and violence without flinching. James Holloway drew a deep breath, his chest expanding as if trying to contain all that he felt. This, he whispered to Claire, is what I wish the whole world could see. A man with every reason to react, and he didn't. He chose something greater. Claire leaned closer, her voice hushed. Greater than himself, James nodded. Greater than himself. Not far away, Ben shifted Tommy on his hip. The boy whispered, Daddy is the soldier. Sad Ben shook his head softly. No, son. He's proud. Proud to stand for the ones who can't. He touched Tommy's small flag. Every step he takes is for them. The boy clutched the flag tighter, his young face solemn. Applause rose once more. Not spontaneous chaos, but deliberate reverence. Parents clapped quietly. Veterans lifted trembling salutes, some with tears streaking their weathered faces. It was not for spectacle, it was for solidarity. Laura Pierce stood motionless, her iPad limp at her side. Notifications buzzed across the screen again, but she didn't look. Her gaze remained locked on Ethan, on the soldier who had upended her understanding of strength. I thought Kane was powerful, she whispered. But this man, he never said more than a handful of words, and he changed everything. Harris shifted beside her, hands jammed into his pockets. He made Kane look small without lifting a finger. His voice was heavy with something between guilt and respect. My father would have called that true steel. The crowd began to murmur again, but not about Kane. Their voices turned toward Ethan, toward the tomb, toward the meaning of the ritual they had just seen tested. A woman's voice cracked as she spoke to her teenage son. This is why we honor soldiers, not because they fight, but because they stand. The boy nodded, his eyes fixed on Ethan. James placed a hand gently on Claire's shoulder. When you grow up, you'll face people who think money makes them powerful. But you'll know the truth. You saw it today. Claire swallowed hard, nodding. I'll never forget. The sun broke fully from behind the clouds, scattering light across the plaza. White marble blazed under the glow rows of headstones, stretching endlessly into the horizon. It was as if the cemetery itself bore witness to what had happened. Laura's shoulders trembled. She whispered, I can't stay tied to him anymore. After today, I'm finished. Harris let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Funny, isn't it? We spent years following him for money, but one soldier's silence made it all look worthless. Ethan pivoted sharply again, rifle snapping with perfection. His silence was complete, his presence unbreakable. For those watching, it was a sermon without words. Ben pressed his forehead gently to Tommy's hair. This is what respect means, son. Remember it, live it. The boy nodded, whispering, I will. As the reporters crowded the gates, shouting questions no one inside answered, the plaza remained untouched. The tomb stood silent. The sentinel marched on, and the crowd knew they had witnessed something eternal. Duty, honor, sacrifice. These were the only currencies that mattered here, and Ethan Ward, red mark still visible on his cheek, carried them with every step. By now, the plaza had thinned, but those who remained carried a look that was unmistakable reverence mixed with awe. Parents crouched to explain what their children had seen. Veterans lingered in silence, some wiping their eyes, others saluting once more. For everyone present, the lesson was branded into memory. Ethan Ward marched on the cadence of his boots, echoing through the crisp air. The red imprint on his cheek was fading, but its meaning endured. His silence had defeated arrogance more effectively than any blow could have. James Holloway felt tears sting as he looked at Claire. I never thought I'd live long enough to see this, he murmured. Claire tilted her head. See what Grandpa... He knelt, voice heavy with emotion. See a man stand for duty in a way that reminded everyone what honor means. When I was your age, I thought strength was in shouting and fists. But strength, real strength, is this. He gestured toward Ethan's steady march. Claire's eyes shimmered. He didn't need to yell or fight. James smiled faintly. Exactly. And that's why we'll never forget him. Not far away, Ben still held Tommy close. The boy rested his head on his father's shoulder, his small voice carrying softly. Daddy, I think the soldier's heart is bigger than the rich man's money. Ben swallowed hard pride, thick in his throat. You're right, son. Bigger by miles. The crowd around them nodded, some whispering prayers, others simply standing straighter. Laura Pierce had moved closer to the rope, unable to look away from Ethan. Her career flashed through her mind, the years spent serving Kane's ego, defending his arrogance, excusing his cruelty. All for money. All for nothing. She whispered, her voice trembling, "I've stood behind the wrong man for too long." Harris beside her crossed his arms, his face hard. "You're not alone. Tomorrow I hand over his keys. I won't serve a man who struck a sentinel." Laura nodded slowly, tears forming. "Neither will I." The sun poured golden light across the marble, catching the tomb's inscriptions. The words seemed sharper now, carved not only in stone, but in the hearts of those who had witnessed Ethan's endurance. The applause began once more, gentle, steady. Parents clapping with their children, veterans saluting, a sound that filled the space with unity. But Ethan did not acknowledge it. His steps never faltered. His silence said it all. He was not there for applause. He was there for the nameless. James placed his hand over Claire's flag. "One day, Em, when someone asks you what honor looks like, you'll tell them about this day." Claire nodded quickly, her voice breaking. "I will." The crowd's reverence deepened as the reporters at the gates shouted questions, their voices blocked by distance and the invisible wall of respect surrounding the tomb. None dared approach. They all knew the spectacle outside could never penetrate the sanctity of the plaza. Ethan pivoted again, rifle-flashing boots clicking. The sound was as steady as a heartbeat. For those watching, it was more than a march. It was a vow. Laura closed her eyes, whispering a vow of her own. "Tomorrow, I walk away from him. And I walk towards something better." Harris murmured, "So do I." The moment was no longer about Kane. It never truly had been. It was about the nameless, the ones whose sacrifice Ethan honored with every silent step. And for all who remained, the lesson was unshakable. Money fades, arrogance crumbles, but duty endures. The afternoon sun slanted lower, washing the cemetery in amber light. The crowd had thinned, yet those who remained seemed rooted by an invisible thread, unwilling to walk away from what they had witnessed. No one wanted to break the rhythm of Ethan Ward's boots, the eternal cadence that now carried a new weight. Ethan marched as if untouched by what had transpired. 21 steps, pause, pivot. The rifle gleamed across his chest, his posture flawless. The faint mark on his cheek was all that remained of Gregory Kane's arrogance, but even that looked less like injury, and more like testament proof that money and pride had broken themselves against silence. James Holloway stood tall, hand resting on Claire's shoulder. His voice, gravelly yet steady, reached those nearby. "Remember this day. Not for the man who shouted, but for the soldier who didn't. That's the lesson that lasts." Claire pressed her little flag to her chest, whispering, "I'll tell everyone about him." Ben held Tommy close, the boy still wide-eyed. Daddy Tommy said softly, "He didn't move even when he got hurt." Ben kissed the top of his son's head. "Because some things are bigger than hurt." He was standing for those who can't stand anymore. A veteran in a wheelchair raised a trembling salute, voice breaking as he whispered, "For the unknown." Laura Pierce, her composure shattered, stepped closer to the rope. Her iPad hung useless at her side. She whispered through tears, "I'll never follow Kane again. After today, I can't." Beside her, Harris nodded, his voice low and final. "Me neither." He showed us who really had strength. The light glowed against the white marble rose, endless as memory. The leaves swirled in the breeze, settling quietly on the ground like tributes too delicate to disturb the sentinel's march. Reporters still crowded the gates, shouting for statements, but their voices felt distant, meaningless. Here within the rope, the story needed no explanation. Everyone who had stood there would carry it with them forever. Ethan pivoted again, rifle snapping to his other shoulder boots, ringing out sharp against the marble. His silence was not emptiness. It was full of honor, full of sacrifice, full of all the voices that could no longer speak. James's eyes glistened as he looked skyward. "Duty, honor, country," he said softly, the words as much prayer as statement. The crowd responded not with cheers but with stillness. Parents held their children, veterans saluted once more, and silence reclaimed the plaza. Ethan Ward marched on, guarding not for himself, but for the nameless, whose sacrifice could never be bought. And all who had witnessed it knew, in a world where wealth and arrogance shout, true strength sometimes speaks only in silence. If you like the story, consider sending a super chat to help bring more similar stories. Now click on the video on the screen to hear another story that is equally powerful and compelling, with courage, sacrifice, and a choice that makes you question everything you know about duty and justice. Click on the video